Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this talk about a rather bad film made of a rather good book. I seem to spend a lot of my time working on and talking about this film, which I don't like very much. The Reluctant Widow was made in 1949 and released in 1950, and it was based on a 1946 novel by Georgette Heyer. It's not even my favourite Heyer, although it does seem to be the Heyer novel that I've read more than any other. And I was thinking recently about why I spend so much time with The Reluctant Widow, and there's a very, very simple explanation. It's the only feature film of a Heyer novel that we have. However much we want Heyer novels to be filmed, and however often participants in the Georgette Heyer read-along, which I host on Twitter, indulge in fantasy casting, we only have one actual movie that we can look at. Now, my relationship with this film started in 2013 when I picked up a 1950 copy of Picture Show magazine in a secondhand bookshop when I was on holiday. I was a Heyer reader at that time, but I wasn't aware of film adaptations of her work. So this was of immediate interest because the cover shows Jean Kent and Guy Rolfe in a British picture being promoted quite heavily in a British film magazine, but the film seems to have sunk without trace. And as somebody who's previously specialised in British cinema, it was something that really piqued my interest. And then in 2015, a contact at the British Film Institute wanted to screen the film. And knowing that I was a Heyer enthusiast, she invited me to introduce it. Now, one of the things you can't do when you're introducing a film that people are paying for is to be too critical about what they're about to see. So I spent quite a lot of time finding things to be positive about, and that was notably the marvellous sets by Carmen Dillon, who was the first female to win an Academy Award for set decoration for Hamlet in 1948, the work of one of the top continuity workers in the industry, Tilly Day, who had a huge amount of experience, and the performance of a new actor called Julian Dallas as Francis Cheviot. And he gives the best performance in the film, although the character is controversially nothing like that of the book. And since then, I keep returning to the film, and I've researched it more deeply. I gave a paper about it at the 2018 Georgette Heyer The Nonsuch Conference at University College London, and I've contributed a chapter about it for the forthcoming publication Georgette Heyer History and Historical Fiction, which is due out from UCL Press in February 2021. And today I'm really grateful to Sam for inviting me to Romancing the Gothic to talk about this film. And in this talk, I'm going to cover three main areas. So I'm going to talk about some of the background to the production and the casting, particularly of the lead character, Elinor. I'm going to talk about some of the deviations from Heyer's original novel and speculate over what the screenwriters thought they were doing in making such deviations. And then I'm going to touch on the critical response to the film. And running through these three themes are Heyer's concerns about what was being done to her novel. Now, for those of you who haven't read The Reluctant Widow, it's the story of Elinor Rochdale and her adventures or misadventures, which start with confusion over the ownership of a carriage. She's planning to go and be a governess to a young child, but she ends up in the wrong carriage, and as a result, she's persuaded to marry a drunk who is on his deathbed. And she inherits a ruined mansion, a ruined, very Gothic mansion called High Noons as a result of this marriage, and she becomes entangled in the affairs of the Carlyon family. The seemingly overbearing Lord Carlyon starts to organise her life, and there is a mystery subplot involving missing army dispatches. But as with many other of Heyer's novels, the mystery takes second place to the development of the relationships between the characters. The book features an enjoyable mixture of Gothic mansions, tangled relationships, and one of Heyer's most enjoyable and funniest secondary characters in the hero's younger brother, Nicky Carlyon. And when The Reluctant Widow was published, Heyer's place in the fiction market was secure. 9 years earlier, on the publication of The Talisman Ring, it was reported that Georgette Heyer is monopolising a corner of the market for historical thrillers. Over 400,000 copies of Miss Heyer's books have been sold in English editions alone. And on the publication of the Corinthian in 1940, it was reported that Miss Heyer proves once more that she can turn out a good yarn and employ all the tricks, devices, and historical hokum which go to make up a successful novel in this genre. It is such good rollicking stuff. Now, reviews of The Reluctant Widow were a little more mixed and greeted the very complex plot with slight scepticism. The reviewer for the Manchester Evening News said that any reluctance on the part of the heroine was just a pose as she proceeded through a swift week or two of adventures. And in The Observer, the reviewer Norman Collins mocked the complexities, but he still enjoyed the book and joked that panels slide, feet tramp up and down secret staircases, a man is murdered, and a plot that would have foxed Wilkie Collins is unfolded in all its wantonness and perversity. Is the novel pure nonsense? Yes, arrant and blatant. Should it therefore be avoided by the select and serious? No, 100 times no. Gusto such as Miss Heyer's comes direct from the gods. And, he predicted, the fictional National Association of Governesses in Fiction would soon have a new member in Elinor Rochdale. And these reviewers were right. The plot of The Reluctant Widow, as a novel, is extremely complex. I mentioned that I've read it more than any other Heyer novel, but I haven't read it since last year, and I do have difficulties remembering who did what to whom, who stole what from whom, and how matters resolve themselves. If you ask me about the characters, about Elinor being trapped by a dog, or Nicky's adventures with a bear, or Carlyon coolly suggesting that Elinor should marry his dissolute relative, I can remember all of that. But missing army dispatches haven't lodged in my mind. And part of my confusion with the book definitely relates to the amount of time that I have spent researching the film, which is far more confusing. A myth has grown up that Heyer didn't want her novels to be adapted into films, and that her experience of the screen version of The Reluctant Widow exacerbated that wish. But this is absolutely not the case. She wasn't opposed to her novels being adapted for film because this could have significantly increased her earning power. She always felt short of cash, although she earned significant income from her writing, and she always worried about her tax bill. Jennifer Closter, in her biography of Heyer, writes that Georgette had always wanted her novels to be made into films, but so far the various proposals from film companies had come to nothing. And she quotes a letter from Heyer to her agent saying, "Why the blazes not one of those stinking film companies can see what a super film Regency Butt would make beats me." Closter also quotes Heyer as saying that she hoped that Fox Films would buy The Talisman Ring, and notes that in 1939, her publisher Heinemann sent producer Alexander Korda her novel about Charles II, Royal Escape, but these projects came to nothing. And when I was searching the American trade press, I picked up a further couple of projects which were announced but didn't come to anything. In 1947, a film of Friday's Child was announced. And in 1959, Motion Picture Daily reported that the screen rights to The Conqueror had been bought by Cinerama for production in the widescreen process, with a screenplay to be written by the playwright R.C. Sheriff, who is now, of course, mostly remembered for Journey's End. It was going to be renamed William the Conqueror for the screen, and it got as far as a film tie-in, because this is the 1963 edition from my collection, which makes it clear it's going to be a spectacular new film. But that never made it to the screen either. And in 1966, a proposed United States television adaptation of False Colours was suggested by the actress Anna Neagle, who was a fan of Heyer and a personal friend of hers. And Jane Aiken Hodge, Heyer's other biographer, refers to a mooted production of An Infamous Army for the anniversary of Waterloo, but nothing came of these. So all we have is The Reluctant Widow. And in September 1946, Motion Picture Daily reported that British producer Sidney Box had bought the rights to The Reluctant Widow. And there's an image of Georgette Heyer carried in the Tatler magazine in 1947, which indicates that to begin with, she had no objection to being associated with the film because her photograph is captioned, The Reluctant Widow is to be filmed. The film was made by Two Cities Films, part of the Rank organisation. It was filmed in 1949 and released in 1950. Bernard Knowles, who'd gained some experience of costume dramas at Gainsborough Studios when he made Jassy, a big Technicolor production, was appointed to direct. Jack Hildyard, who would later shoot Bridge on the River Kwai, was director of photography. Carmen Dillon designed the sets, and they had Tilly Day as their continuity worker. And everything seemed on course for a good film. But sadly, it was not to be, because in the 2 years between the publication of that photograph in the Tatler of Heyer herself and the production, Heyer became so dismayed at what was being done to her work that she refused to see the finished film. And today, many Heyer fans refer to The Reluctant Widow as either a joke or a missed opportunity. But it is rather more interesting than that, because production history, even of bad films, is always interesting. Now, one of the key aspects of a film's success, and particularly the response to an adaptation of a popular novel, comes down to casting. The most important casting decision was, of course, who was going to play Elinor. And in 1948, the Liverpool Echo announced that Margaret Lockwood, then the most popular British star, was due to star in a Technicolor picture of The Reluctant Widow. Lockwood had scored enormous hits, box office hits with Gainsborough melodramas like The Man in Grey and The Wicked Lady in 1946, opposite James Mason. And The Wicked Lady was the first British film to earn £1 million at the box office. And in poll after poll, Lockwood and Mason were voted the biggest stars of the 1940s. In 1948, the Daily Mirror's show business correspondent, Reg Whiteley, reported that he'd talked to Lockwood on the set of The Cardboard Cavalier, and that she had talked then about the fact she was going to be in The Reluctant Widow, a lighter part for her. But by the late 1940s, Lockwood was in dispute with the Rank organisation. She'd been fighting for better parts, and she underwent a period of suspension for being, quote, difficult. I think that's film industry terminology for a woman who knew what parts she wanted to act and what parts she didn't. And I don't know whether the suspension coincided with the final casting decisions for The Reluctant Widow, but whatever happened, she didn't end up being in the film. The early reports that it was going to be filmed in Technicolor with a very big star are interesting, but they are misleading, because it ended up in black and white with far less glitzy casting as the last of the period dramas made by Two Cities Films during the late 1940s as finances became tighter and tighter. Now, despite the lack of Lockwood and the financial constraints at Two Cities, efforts were being made to conjure up the old Gainsborough magic, resulting in press reports that The Reluctant Widow had similar ingredients as in The Wicked Lady: swashbuckling adventure, gallantry, villainy, passion and excitement in a Regency setting with a powerful supporting cast, and it was going to be a highly coloured Regency melodrama in the best Wicked Lady tradition. And there is a direct link back to The Wicked Lady, because at the bottom of the poster on the left of the screen, you'll see that I've highlighted the name Jean Kent, another actor contracted to the Rank organisation, who'd played secondary roles in Gainsborough melodramas, and who had, on a number of occasions, played roles originally announced as Lockwood's. And in June 1949, the Daily Mirror reported that Jean Kent had signed to play the coveted title role in Georgette Heyer's yarn, The Reluctant Widow. Now, whether Heyer would have appreciated her work being linked with the overt passions of the Gainsborough melodramas is debatable, particularly given her interest in really thorough historical research. I mean, you can watch the Gainsborough melodramas and they're great fun, but nobody, I think, would say that they have any pretensions to historical accuracy. Heyer was certainly unhappy with the casting of Jean Kent. Jane Aiken Hodge quotes her as saying, "I am being driven frantic by the advanced publicity from Denham Studios, and I'm trying to think what I can do about it. I feel as though a slug had crawled over me. I think it's going to do me a great deal of harm on account of the schoolgirl public. Already I'm getting letters reproaching me. They have turned the widow into a bad girl part for Jean Kent." And had Heyer read the Daily Express report of Kent's reluctant widow having a whale of a time in a part that is a cross between the wicked lady, Forever Amber, and the barmaid in the local, she would have been extremely concerned about what was happening to her Elinor. Now, Kent is mainly remembered today for those small roles in the Gainsborough melodramas, but also for a film called Good Time Girl, in which she played a juvenile delinquent. And she was known for playing these bad girl parts on screen, despite the fact that her home life was known to be beyond reproach. And she said herself that whenever a director needed an actress who would appear in her cami knickers on screen, it would be her that they would call for, because she says she liked that kind of part. But in interviews, when she looked back on her career, there are two of them, one from 1978 and one from 2006. She made the point that by the late 1940s, early 50s, money was becoming really tight, and some of the films that were made just weren't worth it. There were only a handful of her films that she could bear to watch, she said, and The Reluctant Widow was absolutely clearly not one of them. In 2006, she gave a very extensive interview to the British Entertainment History Project, in which the interviewer goes through her career film by film. But sadly, the one film that isn't mentioned is The Reluctant Widow. And my frustration when I sat through the whole interview, I was very upset about this. I think it was a mistake rather than anybody saying, we don't want to talk about this film. It just got missed off the list. And it's a real shame, because it would have been interesting to find out what she thought about it. Now, despite the Wicked Lady links and Heyer's concerns, this image of Jean Kent from the Tatler, which was taken to publicise the film, is rather more in keeping with Elinor of the novel. And if anything, Elinor in the film, as played by Kent, is slightly more priggish than Elinor in the novel. And the Falkirk Herald was moved to report that in this film, Jean Kent goes good. She might have a reputation as the screen's bad girl, but in The Reluctant Widow, she has a completely different type of role. She appears as a self-possessed woman who finds herself widowed half an hour after her marriage. Becoming involved in smugglers and spies, she asserts herself and marries the man who catches them. But even though Kent's interpretation of Elinor was very proper, Heyer became increasingly unhappy. Jennifer Cluster quotes correspondence that indicates that she felt her novel and her reputation were being badly served. "At all events," she wrote, "I think I can get my name removed from the thing, and I shall. It seems to me that to turn a perfectly clean story of mine into a piece of sex muck is bad faith, and something very different from the additions and alterations one would expect to be obliged to suffer. If I had wanted a reputation for salacious novels, I could have got it easily enough. The whole thing is so upsetting." And I assumed, having found these adverts from local papers, that Heyer had been successful in having her name removed from the project because none of them mention her name. But then I dug a little deeper and found that I was wrong, because these advertisements, which are rather more salacious, and we've got Jean Kent there in a very low-cut gown, and Guy Rolfe in regimentals for some strange reason, given that in the book he's not a military man. this is the sort of sex muck that Heyer was complaining about. And the colour advert warns very sternly that the film is not suitable for children. So I imagine seeing that publicity would have upset Heyer, but what would have upset her even more was what they did to her original source novel. Film adaptations, of course, omit or change events, and they rewrite characters to render their source texts more cinematic. But The Reluctant Widow took this convention to extreme. As a result, the plot became very, very confused. Heyer's emphasis on the developing relationships between the characters and her satirical approach to the Gothic settings were replaced by intrigue and espionage and a film with a very, very uneven tone. Cinema goers were promised an adventurous drama of smuggling, duelling, and death. And to anyone who's read the book, those are not the words that you would use to describe The Reluctant Widow. Smuggling and duelling don't come from Heyer's novel, and there is death, which leads to widowhood, but they really don't sum up what Heyer's novel was all about. So I'm going to look now at some of the deviations from the original novel, and there are so many that I can't cover all of them, but some of the key words that I came up with when I was watching the film as compared to the book were Napoleon, fighting, smugglers, court-martials, lady spies, inquests, dreams, and duels. Heyer's work is so intricately plotted that if one element changes, there's a domino effect onto everything else. And this is what happened with the rewrite of the film. Because as well as watching the film, I managed to get my hands on a copy of the shooting script, which is held in the archives of the British Film Institute. This is actually a mocked up copy because I wasn't allowed to photograph it, but I spent the entire day reading it, and believe me, it's an experience I wouldn't particularly want to repeat, because if you think the film is different from the novel, the shooting script deviates even further. The screenwriters, Gordon Wellesley and Basil Boothroyd, intended that the film would start with a ball on the eve of Waterloo, and it would then move on to Napoleon, who they described as the mounted figure of the Corsican, grim and statuesque, silhouetted against a stormy sky, moving on to Times headlines of Napoleon's moves across Europe as he ends up as the man in destiny acclaimed at Fontainebleau. And this gives us an indication that this film was going to be foregrounding international events rather than being a story that's taking place with such events in the background. Now, this Napoleon sequence wasn't included in the finished film, and I haven't been able to find any evidence of it being filmed. And maybe the screenwriters or the director just felt it wouldn't work. But I did find hints of another intended sequence, which again is in the screenplay and didn't make it onto the screen. Because here we have a scene that takes place supposedly before the novel starts. It's Elinor waiting at an inn for her carriage and her new position as governess. With her is Nicky, who I mentioned earlier, one of my very favourite characters in the whole of Heyer, but not as he's portrayed in this film, and Eustace Cheviot, the drunken relative who she's going to end up marrying. In the film script, Elinor and Nicky travel into Sussex together at the start of the film. They meet in the coach and start up conversation. And when the coach stops at an inn, Elinor is harassed by Eustace, who thinks that she is a woman who's come in answer to an advertisement to marry him, and he assaults her. The assault is interrupted by Nicky, who recognises her from the coach and comes to her rescue. And there is then a confrontation between Eustace and Nicky, which leads to Eustace's eventual death. And narratively, none of this makes any sense, because I don't believe that the character of Elinor would have agreed to marry Eustace if she'd actually met him, because the whole point in the book is that she doesn't meet him until he's on his deathbed, and she enters into this arrangement that she's going to marry him to save the family fortune. Now, what we don't know about this from the still is whether this sequence was ever actually filmed. It might just be a production still. Again, if it was filmed, it was cut out of the finished film. This still was published in the Sketch magazine in 1949 as a promotion for the film. And again, I think anybody who was reading Heyer at the time might have looked at that and thought, well, that doesn't look like it's going to be a film of the novel that I have read and that I know. Smuggling was used to sell the film, but it only warrants a passing mention in the novel as a joke. There's a mention that there might be smuggled brandy at the crumbling mansion. And so Elinor has this response sort of saying, oh, I'm now to enter into dealings with a pack of smugglers. And she's sending up the whole genre. But from this funny exchange, the screenwriters developed a very heavy-handed episode in the film in which a smuggler who is called Scowler climbs in through a window and tries to talk to Elinor about brandy. And in so doing, he shows us that High Noons isn't a safe and secure place at night, but it also helps to confuse the character of Elinor, because the implication is that if she is in the house, she's a woman of bad character. Is the film about brandy smuggling? No. So why this sequence is included and why they went to the trouble of filming it, I really don't know, because it makes no sense at all. But we're coming to the bits which are even more deviant from the book. And here we have a court-martial, Lord Carlyon, which, again, is nowhere in Heyer's original novel. In the film, Carlyon is a military man, whereas, of course, in the book, he's a gentleman of fashion. And the filmmakers composited three of the Carlyon brothers into one so that they could make him a military man and then have scenes set in London. Carlyon in the film is dishonourably discharged from the Duke of Wellington's army with a full platoon of soldiers on parade to witness his epaulettes and sash being taken from him and his sword broken. And according to the shooting script, this court-martial scene was informed by actual words and actions of the court-martial ceremony according to military advisors. And standing by to check authenticity on set was a Mr. C.G.P. Lawson, the author of The History of the Uniforms of the British Army. Now, the filmmakers, if they wanted to make sure the scene looked authentic, they could have asked Heyer, because she would have been able to tell them, given her expertise on the period and her knowledge of militaria. But perhaps it was for the best that they didn't ask her, because she would have said, what on earth are you doing with a court-martial in the middle of the reluctant widow? And this sequence would have been complicated enough as a straightforward addition to the plot, but Wellesley and Boothroyd added a further twist. Carlyon is being discharged from the army, or is he? Somehow his superiors have convinced him to pretend to be a traitor and to be humiliated in front of his men. But it's all subterfuge, because he's agreed to set a trap for a group of French spies. And I was talking to Sam about this morning, and she was saying it's really interesting because choices were made with this film. The working up of the court-martial sequence was significant, and the script shows it in great detail. So somebody sat there and thought, oh, this will make the film even more interesting, exciting, mysterious. I don't know. The whole court-martial sequence seems to have been added to allow the introduction of a completely new character. You will not find Madame de Chevreaux anywhere in Heyer. Now, here she is on screen as played by that wonderful actor Kathleen Byron, who is wasted in this film. She's a femme fatale, a French spy who has used her sexual allure to manipulate virtually all of the male characters. Even Nicky has heard of her, and he's in his teens. In the shooting script, Elinor implies that Madame de Chevreaux takes payment for sexual favours, telling her that, I feel you would do better in the city. The streets would surely provide more customers. Now, this line doesn't make the final film, and I suspect it was cut by the censors. And one of the things I had hoped to be able to do was to have a look at the censorship report on this film, because you can get BBFC reports on scripts and productions, but because of lockdown, I haven't been able to get my hands on it. Anyway, as she is on screen, she adds more and more and more complexity. We're shown into her boudoir, in which she plots with Carlyon to escape to France, and she even has a document of safe conduct all prepared. But before she leaves England, she wants to go to High Noons, the crumbling mansion where Elinor is living, despite the fact she has no relationship with the building at all. And the audience is expected to believe that Carlyon will allow her to go there, because what she wants to do is find the missing army dispatch. It's completely unconvincing, even as a double bluff, but it happens. She travels to High Noons with another new character called Nivelle, who is a reworked and expanded character based on Heyer's Louis de Castres. And she tries to convince Elinor to give her a clock in which the missing memorandum, which is helpfully marked in big letters, highly secret and confidential, is hidden. Further changes take place when Elinor attends the inquest into her short-lived husband's death, but she's saved from having to give evidence because she faints. And of course, in the novel, Elinor doesn't go to the inquest. She stays behind at High Noons and tidies up the library. And the events of the inquest are recounted very, very amusingly by Nikki, who tells her all sorts of stories about how the coroner behaved. But in the film, the slightly comic happenings are turned into a device which has been inserted to make one of the episodes, one of the most bizarre episodes of the film. It's even more bizarre than the court-martial, because on the way back from High Noons after the inquest, Elinor and Carlyon are in a carriage together. They quarrel. He suggests that she should remarry to secure High Noons, and she gets out of the carriage in high dudgeon, scares the horse, it bolts, and takes Carlyon and the carriage with it. And Elinor is terrified that Carlyon might be badly hurt, leading to an extremely odd sequence. And I can't really work this sequence out because narratively it's so problematic. As you will know if you've read the novel, the film starts with a midnight marriage. The novel starts even with a midnight marriage between Elinor and Eustace. This is just about believable. If you suspend your belief a little bit, you can just believe that's the situation that she's got herself into. But the screenwriters felt that this wasn't dramatic enough, and they felt that they could improve on it. So the film includes not just one midnight marriage, but two. The first wedding is faithful to the novel, but the second wedding deviates significantly and makes little sense. Carlyon and Elinor marry about 2/3 of the way through the film. Elinor is sent for in the middle of the night. Carlyon appears to be on his deathbed, and she marries him because she thinks he's dying, and there's a hint that he's broken his back when he was trying to control his bolting horse. And he tells her in true British 1940s cinema style, "I could not die for my country, let me die for you." And they're married there and then, presumably by special license. But as soon as they are married, he gets up and sits up, and he's not dying at all. And he says, "Not a word to anyone till after I'm buried." Now, this is a very, very odd sequence. It's filmed as though it's a fantasy or a dream sequence. And the first time I saw the film, I assumed it was a dream sequence. And somewhere in my brain, I still think of it as being that dream sequence wedding, because it's the only thing that makes sense. But as the film goes on, you realize that this is actually portraying an event which is supposed to have actually happened. And once it's established as having actually happened, any amount of sexual tension, and there wasn't very much to begin with, between Jean Kent and Guy Rolfe just disappears. And despite having watched the film repeatedly, I just can't work out what the filmmakers thought they were doing when they wrote all of this. It's just very, very strange. And again, it was planned out and everything, and nobody stopped to think, this doesn't really add anything other than making things more complicated. Now, I haven't got the time this evening to talk about the crimes that were committed against the character of Francis Cheviot, which I know from Twitter conversations people get very agitated about. And all I'm going to say is that, you know, Francis is set up in the film as being the most dangerous duellist in England, and this is simply because at the end of the film the filmmakers added in a duel sequence which they then spent a lot of their publicity budget talking about. Again, it's not in the book, and there were lots and lots of press reports at the time of Guy Rolfe and Julian Dallas fighting to the death for Jean Kent on the set of The Reluctant Widow. Guy Rolfe was said to have been an ex-boxer, but I think this was an exaggeration on the part of the Rank Studio publicity machine. They even had an ex-Royal Marine fencing instructor called Rupert Evans who came in to arrange the fight for them. And they make a pretty good job of it. The two actors make a pretty good job of it because they're in the hall, they're up the stairs, they're knocking over suits of armour, they enter the library. The duel scene lasts for over 2 minutes, which is quite a long time. But towards the end of the sword play, having gone to all this effort, the filmmakers turn it into a total anticlimax, because it appears then that Francis is about to stab Carlyon with a knife. Carlyon turns the knife on Francis, and this would have made a satisfactory climax. But instead, the viewer is then distracted by the new character Nivelle and Nikki, who are both carrying guns, and then there's a shooting, but that takes place off screen behind closed doors. The sequence is so confusing that the last time I was looking at this, at the film, I was watching it on a Steenbeck machine in the basement of the British Film Institute, and I wound this sequence back a few times. So I was trying to work out the sequence of events in it and just try to make sense of what was happening. You know, all this effort had been put in to filming it, and it's really badly put together. And I spent so long fiddling with the film reel that I actually snapped it, and I had to go and confess to the technician that I had broken The Reluctant Widow, and he had to come and mend it. I think it was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life, actually. But you know, you never know, maybe the missing bit, the snap bit, improved the editing. You just don't know, really. Now, all of these additions and changes add nothing to Heyer's original story. And of course, a film needs to show rather than describe events, but it would surely have been possible to do so without the elaborations and complications that the screenwriters added to The Reluctant Widow. So if you take the court-martial, maybe it would have worked if it had resulted from a misunderstanding rather than an elaborate double bluff. If they had to add the glamorous French spy, was it necessary to stretch credibility and have her going to high noons to steal the missing memorandum? And if such an effort was expended in filming a duel, surely it would have been more effective to allow the viewer to focus on the outcome of that duel rather than a distracting off-screen shooting. And as I said earlier, 1 midnight marriage is believable, but 2 looks very much like carelessness. The scriptwriters fundamentally misunderstood Heyer's ability to create believable characters and a satisfying plot. And instead of using her source material to create a faithful adaptation, they over-embroidered her ideas and lost the essence of The Reluctant Widow along the way. And they also lost all of the humour, because as I mentioned earlier, Nicky is one of my favourite characters in the whole of Heyer, and it's because he's so funny. But here, as played by Anthony Tancred, he's simply a callow youth, and it's such an opportunity that's missed. Now, the main mystery for me about The Reluctant Widow on screen isn't about the stolen memorandum or the midnight marriages, but it's about what did the screenwriters think they were doing? And the answer to that is, well, we don't really know, because there aren't papers or letters or diaries that tell us how they came to misread Heyer so badly. But I'd like to suggest there are 2 reasons that could have informed their decisions when they were writing that screenplay. And the first one is that they chose to privilege the mystery element of the story over the development of the characters and their relationships. Perhaps they felt this would appeal more to a male as well as a female audience. But if you read Heyer, you may think, like I do, that, for example, in the Talisman ring, I don't actually care about what happened to the ring. I like the witty exchanges between Tristram and Sarah. And in The Quiet Gentleman, I can't get excited about who's going to do away with Gervais, but I want to see how the relationships at Stanion develop. And yeah, there's smuggling in The Unknown Ajax, which is okay, but what I really want to read is Anthea being called Love by Hugo in a Yorkshire accent. And in The Reluctant Widow, I really don't care who stole the memorandum and who got murdered. So this is a misjudgment, I think a misreading of Heyer on the part of the filmmakers. And the second thing I think that must have been on their minds is the fact that in The Reluctant Widow, a lot of the action takes place away from the page and then therefore away from the screen. When The Reluctant Widow was published, it was at a time when local librarians routinely reported in their local newspaper their new acquisitions. And in County Wicklow, the librarian there noted that the widow had plenty of conversations, but perhaps not enough pictures. And this comment presumably related to Heyer's writing of key scenes. So there's the inquest, Carlyon in London, some of the murder scenes, and these are all reported as conversations after the event. And they highlight Elinor's isolation in the crumbling high noons. And they also emphasize that her knowledge of the circumstances in which she finds herself is usually learned through Carlyon or Nicky, rather than through her own knowledge. And this, of course, works in a novel, but it's less effective on screen. And the filmmakers adapting the original text would have wanted to show the audience what was happening and substitute plenty of conversations with enough pictures. And in doing so, they lost more than they gained. When the picture was completed, there are hints that two cities and Rank were uncertain about its likely critical reception because it had no press screening. So it was released out to audiences before the critics had a chance to pronounce on it. So you get audiences in and then the critics pronounce, and the critics were pretty savage. So the Irish Independent made the note that, you know, Elinor doesn't die, the filmmakers make sure that she doesn't die and she's not bored. Unfortunately, they do not do the same for the audience. He said it was very stuffy and very dull. And one other reviewer said that Elinor has obvious difficulty in keeping a straight face, and that the director, Bernard Knowles, should have decided whether the film was to be a burlesque of costume drama or a high romance. How much of the humour is intentional is open to question. Now, it can't be assumed that the critics who were savaging the film like this were familiar with Heyer's novels, and they would have been reviewing the film as a work in its own right, and their irritation at the deficiencies in the plot and characterization wouldn't have arisen from frustrations about changes as the story transitioned from text onto screen. And for a Heyer reader, it's very, very difficult to watch the film if you know the novel, because what you then are focusing on is what those deviations are. The critical response to the film cannot have been good for Heyer's reputation, because those critics or audiences who were unfamiliar with her novel and saw her name appearing on the screen at the beginning of the film may well have assumed that they were watching a faithful adaptation of her work. She herself refused to see the film. Her son Richard did attempt a viewing, and given that, according to his obituary, the character of Nicky, my favourite character, was based on him, he would have had an interest in seeing what it turned out like on screen. But apparently he walked out halfway through. It's hard to disagree with a very acid review that was published in the Derby Evening Telegraph. And this said, "Hey-ho for Regency melodrama boys, with Napoleon prowling dangerously on the continent and smugglers lurking with brandy casks in the shrubberies, where rapiers clash, ladies can show their shoulder blades, and dispatches helpfully marked, the Duke of Wellington, most secret and confidential, change hands among the frills and powder puffs of Milady's boudoir." With a consistently heavy treatment, this might have been a sound and not unentertaining melodrama. With a consistently light one, a good satire on costume drama. But the prevailing mood wavers wildly between these extremes, and the resultant impression is that the director knew neither what he was trying to do nor how to do it. And this sums up exactly what's wrong with The Reluctant Widow on film. The original novel is very funny, but the film lacks its lightness, its intrinsic humour, and it's uncertain about its genre. Is it comedy, thriller, or melodrama? Thanks to the screenwriter's misguided attempts to introduce a more complicated web of intrigue with new characters and unconvincing episodes, it's fallen into a somewhat deserved obscurity. Now, when I introduced this film at the BFI in 2015, and I had to be so careful to stress the film's positive aspects, it did go down quite well because it is interesting. One film historian colleague who doesn't read Heyer always says to me, "Oh, I really like The Reluctant Widow." But on the other hand, my partner who was at that screening remembers it as that terrible Georgette Heyer film with the ripping off of the epaulets at the court-martial. If you want to see an interesting film from 1950, which could have been good but wasn't, or you want to look at really, really fantastic set design, then do take a good look at The Reluctant Widow. The actors did a good job with the material they were given. They might have been miscast, but they really did give it their best. But if you watch the film, don't expect the wit and the deft plotting of Georgette Heyer. You're looking at something completely different. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I don't know if people want to just note down there, you can contact Dr. Lucie on Twitter at Miss LV. There's also the Georgette Heyer read along, which we welcome people. Well, she actually got nothing to do with me. I don't know why I took credit for that then. The tags there, and also you can check out her blog, which I have also put links to on Twitter. And there is an article on The Reluctant Widow there with some more of those juicy quotes from Heyer herself. Are you okay to stop sharing, Lucie?
Yeah.
There we go. So thank you so much. I'll stop recording so we can have an open question time now.